Evening. Welcome everyone to tonight's meeting of the Urban Planning Delegated Committee. Before we commence the meeting, I request that all mobile telephones are turned off or switched to silent. Thanks very much. My name is Councillor Westgalt and I chair this committee. I will start by introducing my fellow councillors. Seated on the left-hand side of the horseshoe table, Councillor Lisa Hollingsworth, Councillor Shima Abuki, Councillor Michael Nolan, Councillor Felicity Sinfield. On the other side of the horseshoe table, Councillor Victor Franco, Councillor Mal Osborne-Smith, Councillor Rob Vallier, Councillor John Friend Pereira, and Councillor Chris Pattis. I acknowledge Manager Governance and Legal, Mr. Brian Wee to my left, and Director Urban Planning, Mr. Scott Walker to my right. There are other officers in attendance tonight and they'll be introduced as they present their reports. General information. The Urban Planning Delegated Committee meeting is being live streamed on the Council's YouTube to enable viewing by the public of the proceedings. This meeting is also being recorded and will be made available again on Council's YouTube as soon as practicable after the meeting. The primary purpose of the Urban Planning Delegated Committee is to deal with matters under the Planning and Environment Act and the Building Act. This committee actually has delegated powers to make decisions on behalf of Council. For those of you presenting this evening, when we come to the agenda item, it will be first introduced and spoken to by an officer. Then I will call you forward one by one to come and join us at the horseshoe table. If you are making submission, please present your viewpoints clearly and concisely on why you support or oppose the planning application. Please do not repeat, if you wouldn't mind, points that earlier speakers have made, and keep your submission focused on relevant issues and points not previously raised. If you're opposed to the planning application, please tell the committee why you disagree and suggest an alternative approach that would satisfy your concerns. Please focus on your concerns rather than matters of history or details in the officer's report. There's a strict 3-minute limit for each speaker, including councillors, and whilst I as chair can vary the time, I seldom will. At the 2.5-minute mark, I will ring a bell, and which indicates you have 30 seconds left to finish your presentation. For those in the gallery this evening, I would like to take this opportunity to remind you to extend due courtesy and respect to each other and to the committee as a whole, and refrain from any inappropriate behaviour. This includes remaining quiet while others are addressing the meeting and not disrupting the decision-making process of the committee. You may only address the council with the consent of the chair and must take direction from the chairperson whenever called upon to do so. Where members of the community disrupt or fail to comply with the direction, the chairperson may cause them to be removed from the chamber. I'm sure that's not going to be the case tonight. And just to finish, I would like to encourage all submitters, officers and councillors to speak directly into the microphone. This will enable us all to hear very clearly what you're presenting. I will now move to apologies. Mr. Wee, are there apologies this evening?
Through you, Chair, Councillor Tawney is an apology this evening.
Thank you, Mr. Wee. Declaration of conflicts of interest of any councillor or council officer. Councillors or council officers, are there any conflicts of interest that you wish to foreshadow at this time? There appear to be none. So we'll move straight forward into the business of this evening. Item 3.1. 936 to 938 Toorak Road, Camberwell. An application to amend an existing planning permit for PPE 13-00916.02 associated with an apartment building. This evening, Kelly Caparoso, Principal Urban Planner, will present the officer's report. Thank you.
Thank you. Through you, Chair, I present UPDC item 3.1 for the amendment of an existing planning permit PP 13/00916.02 for the land at 936 to 938 Toorak Road, Camberwell. It is proposed to amend the existing permit for a two-storey apartment development containing 12 apartments. The amendment proposes a different design response and minor changes to the building envelope. This includes reducing the size of the basement, resulting in a reduction of 2 visitor car parking spaces. The application was placed on public notification and 20 objections were received. Council officers submit the proposed amendment is appropriate and complies with the relevant planning policies for the following reasons. The proposed amendment is generally consistent with the outcomes anticipated by the existing permit. The proposed amendment will not unreasonably impact on the amenity of neighbouring dwellings. Conditions have been included to ensure that all deemed to comply Clause 55 planning scheme standards relating to amenity, which include overlooking, are met. The design fits comfortably within the streetscape and has been well articulated along all elevations. The proposed materials are of a high quality and visually interesting to both the public and private realms. Adequate space has been provided to allow for meaningful canopy tree planting, and the proposal does not remove any additional trees. The application is supported by Council's arborists, subject to conditions requiring a tree management plan and landscape plan. All resident car parking has been provided in accordance with Clause 5206. The reduction of 2 visitor car parking spaces is supported by Council's traffic engineer, and there is adequate availability of on-street car parking in the area. The proposal improves on the existing permit's ESD response and achieves a 7-star energy rating and best practice 58% best rating. It is recommended that Council issue a notice of decision to grant an amended planning permit subject to the conditions detailed in the officer recommendation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Caparasso. We will now move to public submissions. Tonight, 2 people have indicated they want to make submissions. 1 has indicated they will be for and the other against. Once I have announced your name, please come forward and sit with us at the head of the horseshoe table. If submitters aren't present, I will move directly to the next speaker. I will remind you at this point in time there is a strict 3-minute limit on your presentation. And I'd ask you to please commence your submission with your name and the suburb in which you live. So can I call upon Laura Valmorbida and Damien Kerr? And I just remind, are you both speaking tonight or one speaking for both? Thank you.
Thank you, councillors and committee members, for your time this evening. We appreciate the time. I am Lara Valmorbida. I live at 1 Martin Road in Glen Iris, which is the property immediately adjacent to the subject site. We have had many discussions over more than 10 years now. 10 years ago, the council and the neighbours were actually on the same side of the argument of not approving an application to go ahead and build apartments on this site. We're on the same side. We visited VCAT together in November 2014, and in December 2014, VCAT actually overrode the council's decision at that point in time. We have been together in conversations since then. In 2017, September, we collaboratively worked together to look at what would be an acceptable response on that site. And here we are again 10 years later, as with another bite of the cherry from the applicant. I object to the recommendation that was put forward by the council last week, and I object on a number of different grounds. The first is the reduced amenity to my property on number 1 Martin Road. The setbacks and the increased bulk on this property has impacted our amenity. Since the VCAT approved diagrams and plans, this applicant has chosen to increase the height of this building and move it closer towards the boundary, the southern boundary with which we share a fence line. Not only have they increased the height, they've actually raised the finished floor level as well. So while this site is actually on an increased side of the slope, it is actually on a higher than average fall of their land. The rise over run of this building is actually much larger than the natural ground level, and it's increased since the last VCAT approval 10 years ago. This impacts us because of the reduced sunlight and the sense of bulk, which is now more sheer and more brutal than what the VCAT plans were, which actually requested or stated that it needed to be articulated. The traffic plans were based on a false set of information. The traffic study was done on June 21, 22, which was Friday and Saturday at 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. These are not peak hours. Peak hours on Martin Road is between 8 and 9 a.m. Monday to Thursday. So this is a false study. The lack of visitor car parking space will severely impact the amenity, not just of us, but of all the neighbours. We already have parkers from down Toorak Road from the other developments.
Ms Valdemeter, can I ask you to move towards wrapping up? Thank you very much.
Thank you. The linking structures that were there before are no longer there. It is a sheer brutal building on this site. It's not about whether this goes ahead or not. We absolutely do want a suitable development to go ahead in that property. It's about whether this application is actually responsible enough and makes use of this site for the betterment of people in this area.
Thank you. Councillors, are there questions of this presenter? We do have. Councillor Hollingsworth.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for your presentation. Just one question with regard to the increased height that you referred to.
Yes.
Has there been any discussion with the applicant about increased boundary fencing to afford you additional privacy?
No, there hasn't been any discussion. I would also say that the boundary fencing we have now is a 2.7 metre high fence, of which 1 metre of that is lattice, so it is permeable. Right now, the finished floor level of the proposed development actually starts within that space of the lattice work. So it actually starts at the 1.7 to 1.8 metre mark. I will be looking out at the floor from my windows. In fact, I'll have to look up to that. There has been no discussion on that.
Thank you. I'll have a follow-up question with the officers later. Thank you.
Thank you.
Councillor Franco.
Thank you, Chair. I have a few questions. Precisely what are you seeking? Are you seeking council to refuse, or are you seeking council to impose an amendment or amendments of some kind?
Yeah. The optimal response on this site would be to refuse his application and have a number of townhouses. But I'm a pragmatist. Mm-hmm. What I would like council to consider are amendments to this, and that is to relocate the building back to where it was and reduce the height to where it was on the southern boundary, which faces my northern boundary. I request that the council also state that the visitor car parking spaces are reinstated to lessen the traffic impacts to our neighbours. There are a number of conditions that were put into the submission, including to deal with the overlooking, including putting planter boxes in balconies. In my view, these are not permanent solutions. Planter boxes can be easily removed by residents when they move in, and/or planter boxes are no good if they don't have living plants in them. So the overlooking protections are not adequate in the conditions.
Thank you. Through you, Chair, a couple more questions. The increased height, is the increased height a product of this amendment that we've got?
It is. It's
How
the
much is it?
increased height as increase the starting level in terms of the finished floor level because of the way the basement has not been dug into the ground as much as it was last time, and I can only assume that's done to decrease building costs and to maximise profits in this case. So the whole building on the southern side has actually been elevated since the VCAT approved plans.
Okay. Do you have a sense of how much that is?
0.6 metres.
Okay.
And it's come towards the southern boundary another half a metre.
So this is the rear boundary, not the front boundary of the...
Correct. It's the southern boundary of the applicant site, which is our northern boundary.
And do you have a sense, are you able to advise how much closer it is to your property?
0.5 metres.
0.5, okay. Thank you, that's all.
Thank you very much for your presentation. There doesn't appear to be any further questions this evening.
Thank you.
I now call upon Chris Stanley to come forward and present to us.
Thank you. Good evening, councillors. Chris Stanley is my name. I'm the Director of Splinter Society Architecture, the architect for this project, and I currently reside in Brunswick East.
Thank you.
For point of reference, 5 generations before me were born and bred in Boroondara, and our client is a Boroondara resident, so we're very knowledgeable of Boroondara's urban fabric. The reason I'm sitting here with an amendment on the table is that I inherited this project from a previous designer in 2021, and this project went to market and didn't receive a large number of sales, and we sort of engaged with the potential buyers over quite a long period and found that the target market was a downsizing market in this area, and there are a number of design aspects that we'd inherited that weren't highly appealing to a downsizing buyer. There's a 3-metre fall across the site, and accessibility was difficult in some locations. There are a number of sort of steps through the building. The materiality was seen as a negative for the downsized buyer in this area. They wanted something a little bit more modern, a little bit more fresh, a little bit lighter. There was a real push for increasing the sustainability aspects of the proposal and slight layout changes. So just internal amenities, slightly bigger living rooms, bigger main bedrooms. And so to meet this demand, we went back to the table and had a look at how we could redesign the building effectively without changing the envelope significantly and without really impacting on any of the Res Code Section 55 requirements of this site. So we then proceeded to engage with Sylvia, Council's urban designer, on what would be an appropriate response given the context on Toorak Road, and came back with several different iterations that we kind of worked through with Sylvia to present how we could really rebrand this building. It's essentially the same mass, the same form, but trying to work better with the 3-metre fall across the site to make it more accessible. It is correct that this does have a minor impact to the southern neighbour that you've just heard from. We believe it's about 150 mil encroachment further to the south boundary and a 400 mil increase in height on that south boundary. Overall, though, the development presents about 500 mil on average lower across the whole site than the currently approved development does. So, having said that, it's also well inside the B17 setback. So this amendment, the plan was to come back with something that didn't affect the amenity of the area, didn't impact on the envelope or the neighbours. It was really an exercise in making this more accessible, more sustainable, more relevant to the market buyer in the area, and present something that was newer and fresher to the neighbourhood. The overall, we've still got 12 apartments. There's been no change in the number of apartments. There's been no change in the number of car parks required on site for the occupants, and all amenity aspects have been dealt with through the planning application process.
Thank you, Mr. Stanley.
Thank you.
Councillors, now time for questions. Councillor Hollingsworth.
Thank you for your presentation. Hearing the prior presenters speak about the perceived impact on her boundary, do you know if there is any specific overlooking issues that you might be able to mitigate through minor amendments?
Yeah, look, working through the planning application, we're not allowed to overlook the neighbouring properties. So we've been through that process, working with council to ensure that we're fully compliant for amenity impacts, be it overlooking, be it overshadowing. We're well within the setbacks. So it's compliant on all these fronts as determined by council's planning officer.
Okay, thank you. I thought there was mention that there was some overlooking, but I'll check with officers later. And the question I asked about the fence, and I know that's a civil matter and can't be banned by council's determination tonight, but are you able to advise if there is an intent to put a new boundary fence and potentially, for example, at a 3 metre height?
The current proposal has significant landscape setbacks on all sides, so we worked with John Patrick to develop a contemporary native landscape on all sides. The exact treatment of every boundary fence, as you say, is a civil matter, so I couldn't tell you exactly what was on the approved plans or the current approved plans and what's been put forward today. Sorry, that's sort of a detail matter I'd need further input on. Yeah.
All right, thank you. And look, if I may, just one final question. I just want to understand that you've heard the resident and the concerns, and that you would keep that in mind if this application was supported.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Councillor Franco.
Thank you. Just following on from my colleague's question, the presenter before raised the issue of overlooking and the use of planter boxes to preclude overlooking, and she raised concerns with the longevity of that approach, and if there's no plants in the planter boxes, then how does that address it? So I'd just like to hear your comments on that, and relying on that, how you see that. I'll also ask the council officers, but...
Sure. The condition that was put forward relating to overlooking actually relates to the eastern property, not the southern property of this development. And any time that planters are proposed as an overlooking device, you can't take into account the foliage or the plant. It's actually the planter structure that has to comply with the requirements of the planning scheme, and plants are in addition to that. And often we use that plant as a mechanism to soften and kind of soften the whole elevation of a building. Bear in mind that, yeah, this is to the east and not the southern neighbour, but of course, taking note of any concerns the neighbour has about, any amenity impacts.
Thanks. Through you, a couple more questions, Chair. You mentioned that the development is lower overall. I didn't catch what you said. Could you repeat that?
Yeah, correct. We're an average of 500 mil across the site lower than the previous scheme, and one of the reasons this has been achieved is we're further set into the cut at the front on Toorak Road, and previously there was a gabled roof form, quite a complicated gable roof form that zigzagged up and down the site. We've opted for more of a contemporary clean roof form and still kept that fenestration within the depth of the facade and the fins and the articulation of the elevation.
Thanks. And just two short questions, Chair. The setbacks are still within the planning scheme?
Setbacks are fully compliant with the planning scheme.
Okay, and my final question, just the sustainability measures, could you talk to them a little bit? I understand the flat roof is critical to achieving some of the sustainability outcomes, and I'd be interested in understanding that.
Yeah, correct. So the original scheme wasn't subject to, it was prior to the implementation of Burundara's sustainability requirements. So this planning amendment was the first opportunity we had to do an assessment of the environmental capacity of this scheme. It achieved a 58% best practice, and one of the reasons for doing that is we're able to load a significant number of photovoltaic cells on this flat roof, whereas previously a lot of the roof was pitched and kind of awkward angles up and down, and it just didn't meet the prevailing kind of solar orientation required for optimum photovoltaic use. So now we have a really substantial amount of photovoltaics that are being used both internally and individually by each of the apartments, and also for all the common area amenity.
So individual apartments will have their own cells as well for their own individual, as well as common areas?
Absolutely, yep. Yeah, and that's been outlined in the the environmental report that was submitted.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. That seems to have exhausted questions. Thank you, Mr. Stanley, for your
Thank you for
presentation.
your time.
We will now return to officers for matters arising.
Thank you. Through you, Chair. Firstly, in relation to the inquiries about overlooking, so to the south, there are 8 windows proposed. 2 of those windows are highlight windows where they have a sill height of a minimum of 1.7 metres above the finished floor level. And the other 6 of those windows have obscure glazing under 1.7 metres. So that fully complies with Res Code without any changes via condition. Along the eastern elevation, the balconies are within 9 metres of the secluded private open space of the neighbour. There's a non-compliance of about 300 mil of overlooking to the east. So given this is a minor non-compliance, but we also want to manage overlooking without requiring these windows to be fully screened to 1.7, impacting on the daylight and amenity of the apartments, a suggestion was put forward that we increase the width of the planter box 300 mil. So that means that the setback of the balcony to the neighbour is 9 metres and therefore no screenings required. So this was seen as a better outcome than just covering it in screening. In terms of the setbacks to the south, since this permit was issued, when we now have deemed to comply standards and the setback complies with the deemed to comply standards, the changes also have reduced the paving along the southern interface and provided planting. So that was seen as also improving that interface as well. Thank you.
Councillors, are there any questions of officers tonight?
If I may.
Councillor Hollingsworth.
Thank you. So the increased planting capability, are you fairly confident that that will provide screening in the area that the presenter spoke about? And sorry, just while you're checking on that, does council have any ability to have some oversight of I think it was Ian Patrick as the landscaper? Do you see the landscape design and endorse those documents, or is that done through planning surveyor?
Thank you. Through you, Chair, we have requested a landscape plan. They have also provided a landscape plan with the application material, and that will become an endorsed document that will need to be complied with. The planting that they've provided along the interface, along the southern boundary, includes a number of trees and shrubs that it's not used for screening in terms of an overlooking sense, but it's just to soften that interface. Thank you.
Thank you.
Councillor Nolan.
Thank you. Through you, Chair, can you just enlighten us? I think the first speaker mentioned that 2 car parks had been removed from the original VCAT position, and I'm just sort of looking up on the screen. I'm seeing car parking mentioned a couple of times, but can you enlighten from where we started to where they've finished, please?
Thank you. Through you, Chair. The application seeks to remove the 2 visitor car parking spaces. So on the site under clause 5206, for every 5 dwellings, there needs to be 1 visitor car parking space, and those 2 visitor car parking spaces are proposed to be removed as part of this application.
Have you further questions?
I have one
Councillor?
further question on, is there any basis for removing the 2 visitor car parks? From a
Thank you.
planning point of view.
Thank you. Through you, Chair. There's a number of considerations that the traffic engineers will go through when they provide their comments to us as to whether they support the removal of car parking. One of those considerations is the availability of existing on-street car parking to accommodate visitors. They did a survey of the area, the applicant did a survey of the area and provided it to the traffic engineers, which demonstrated that there was enough car parking in the existing street network to accommodate visitor car parking spaces. And the other aspect is the availability of public transport and alternative methods of travel. So in this instance, the traffic engineers supported the reduction of the 2 visitor car parking spaces. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Is that Councillor Osborne-Smith?
Thank you, Chair. Just a few questions, if I may. The first objector claimed the height difference was in the order of 600 millimetres and the southern setback issue was in the difference of 500 millimetres between the original application and the current one. The architect claimed, in fact, the differences were much less, 400 millimetres and 150 millimetres. It's all a question of centimetres, but could you perhaps provide some illumination to us, councillors, as to what the correct numbers are? Do you want to take that one on notice? I've got a couple more questions, perhaps.
Through yourself, Chair, just while officers are contemplating the response to that question, what we have to understand here is that we have a sloping site. So the variance in height depends on at what point you're measuring that. So it's not a simple... we're not necessarily comparing apples with apples when the two parties are actually giving their commentary or feedback on the variance in height, because we might be looking at it from different points along the site.
Perhaps I'll move on to a couple of other questions, if I may. Obscured glazing. Can you give the councillors some assurance as to what method is required to be used to obscure glazing? Is a plastic film acceptable, or does it need to be a permanent glazed structure that can't be changed?
Thank you, and through you, Chair, the expectation there is that it's a fixed, permanent treatment, and we wouldn't accept a film that's applied after the fact.
So how is that checked?
The expectation is set out in the endorsed plans, and that is enforceable. So if there is a concern that the installation isn't as per the plans, our investigation officers will look into that.
Okay.
Just through yourself, Chair, I might just add to that, what's on the endorsed planning permit plans then needs to be mirrored on the building permit plans. So the building permit plans must be consistent with those planning permit plans, and they are then signed off by the relevant building surveyor.
Yeah, so it's clear, is it, on the planning permit plans that obscure glazing is in fact a fixed structure, not just using the words obscure glazing, and it can be followed up by appropriate compliance officers. Okay. My final question relates to the maintenance of planting. Is the planting on the southern boundary common property or private property of one of the apartments? And as a follow-up question to that, if it's common property, what assurances does the planning permit give us that planting will be maintained over the medium term?
I'll answer part of that through you, Chair. Landscaping, whether it's in common property or in private property, is enforceable. It's set out and endorsed in the landscape plans that form part of the endorsement package. And if that vegetation is not maintained or dies or is removed, and that's reported to us, we can follow up on that through our compliance team. And perhaps Kelly can confirm if it is in common or private property once we get that information, but it doesn't change our expectation around its maintenance.
And how long might that compliance stand? Is it months, years?
In perpetuity.
Thank you. Do we have an answer?
Yes, thank you. Through you, Chair. It's in private property, so it's for the ground floor dwellings.
So just to be clear, if that new owner pulled up those plans, poisoned them, wanted a concrete backyard, let's be extreme. You're saying that a neighbour or anyone objecting to that can raise this issue with compliance officers of council, and because the planning permit requires some level of screening in perpetuity, that can be required to be reinstated. Have I got that right? Okay, thank you.
Correct. We might now return to the height difference. Can we just maybe finish Councillor Osborne-Smith's queries?
Thank you. Through you, Chair, to give you some idea on how sloping this site is, there's a 2 metre crossfall from the east to the west. So that's why there's a number of changes in the heights, and also looking at the change to the design from a pitched roof. If you're taking the height from the top of the pitched roof, it's about 600 mil. If you're taking it from the floor level, it's about 300, from the height of the ceiling, it's about 300. So it does change across the site, and it does change because of the design.
Thank you.
And again, through yourself, Chair, but I might just add, I think the important point in regard to the heights and setbacks is that they all comply with the Res Code requirements. So they meet the requirements in regard to heights and setbacks.
Thank you.
Councillor Franco.
Thank you, Chair. I'd just like to follow on the questioning from my colleague seated next to me, Councillor Osborne-Smith, in relation to the planter boxes on the ground floor units. My understanding when I heard the discussion was that it wasn't the plantings that were required for compliance with the overlooking, but the depth that the planter boxes providing further distance from, so I'm not sure how deep they are, 30 centimetres, 40 centimetres, so by pushing that you can't get as close to the property boundary, and therefore the developer's proposal and the architect's vision ensures that the occupant isn't close enough to the property or is sufficiently far from the property boundary to comply with the overlooking. Is that correct? Irrespective of what's planted in those planter boxes?
Through you, Chair, the planter boxes are required on the first floor of the eastern elevation. And yeah, irrespective of what's planted in there, the purpose of them is to increase the setback so it complies with the standard. So that's on the first floor of the east elevation. When there's planting in there, it will further improve that presentation, but it's not required as such.
So there's no need to enforce, just to be clear about, there's no need to enforce plantings in the planter boxes to ensure compliance. The compliance is the structure itself. So it's not really about enforcing anything in those planter boxes. It simply provide over an additional shadowing or, obscuring.
Thank you. Through you, Chair, in the upper level planter boxes, they will be shown on the landscape plan. We will ask them to show what plantings will be in there, and they are enforceable, but they're not required from an overlooking perspective.
Thank you.
That appears to have exhausted questions, and in fact, the public submission phase of tonight's thing on this item. We'll now move to a motion. I'm now in search of a motion.
I'm happy to move the officer's recommendation. Thank you.
Do we have a seconder? Councillor Hollingsworth.
Happy to second, thank you.
Is anyone opposed to this motion? We are not. Councillor Franco, do you wish to speak to your motion?
Just briefly, thank you, Chair. I'm moving the officer's recommendation in light of the fact that the proposal is compliant and is in many ways an improvement over what was approved previously. I have heard and I understand the concerns of the neighbour adjacent to the south. And whilst those concerns are there and arguably valid, and I can understand any increase in heights and proximity to the neighbour's property, and I know that that will have a degree of adverse impact, but the property is fully compliant, and given that, I mean, we don't really have an option, I feel, but to approve what's before us. I think there are some other advantages in relation to the development in terms of the ESD improvements, which are significantly enhance what's there, and I also think some of the design improvements are good, but in relation to the concerns that the neighbour has outlined, I just don't see that we're in any position to really request any changes to it. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Franco. To the second, Councillor Hollingsworth, I think it's unopposed. We'll move straight forward. I will now propose to put this motion. Those in favour? It's unanimous. Thank you. Let's declare it carried. We'll now move to item 3.2 on the agenda, 86 Wattle Road, Hawthorn, Heritage Overlay, Outcomes of an Exhibition, Amendment C400 Borough. The officers' report tonight will be presented by Kristen Williamson, Manager, City Futures. Thank you. Oh, it won't be.
Sorry, Chair, I'll do it. Nick Brennan, Senior Strategic Planner.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And through you, Chair. Amendment C400 proposes to include 86 Wattle Road, Hawthorn in the Heritage Overlay as an individually significant property. This report details the outcomes of formal exhibition of the amendment. In March 2021, residents requested that Council investigate the heritage significance of Wattle Road, Hawthorn, with the aim of including the street in a precinct heritage overlay. GML Heritage was engaged to carry out this heritage investigation. While GML did not recommend introduction of a larger Wattle Road heritage precinct, several properties in Wattle Road, including 86 Wattle Road, were recommended for individual heritage protection. On the 6th of March 2023, an application to demolish the building was received. In response, an application was made to the Minister for Planning for an interim heritage overlay. That interim heritage overlay application was approved on the 8th of August 2024. On the 5th of June 2023, the UPDC resolved to seek authorisation to prepare and exhibit a planning scheme amendment to place a permanent heritage overlay over 86 Wattle Road. Authorisation was granted on the 18th of July 2024. Formal exhibition was carried out between the 22nd of August and the 23rd of September 2024. Council received 109 submissions, of which 59 were opposing and 50 were in favour. Key issues raised in those submissions include general opposition to the proposed heritage overlay, opposition due to constraints placed on the property owner, oppositions due to impact on development opportunities, housing affordability and housing provision, opposition due to the condition of the property, as well as general support for the proposed heritage overlay. Officers are now recommending that the UPDC resolve to request an appointment of an independent planning panel and to refer all submissions received to that panel for consideration. Thank you.
Thank you very much. 5 people have indicated they wish to speak tonight. 2 are against and 3 are in support of the officer's recommendation as presented. I call upon first Mr. Ng, if you could please join us at the horseshoe table. Please take your seat. You want to hand them out?
I pass on my report to you.
Maybe if we can just pass those around as you move forward. Mr. Doonan, if, just before we begin, if I can just remind you to start with your name and the suburb in which you live and to keep a presentation within 3 minutes.
Mr. Chair, my name is Hao Ng, Town Planning Consultant. I act on behalf of David Nguyen, owner of the 86 Water Road property. We oppose the heritage overlay on the land. If you have, this is a short report. I ask you to read page 1, the highlighted part, which is written by your council town planner. What he said was that heritage overlay can only be applied to places of identified heritage significance and cannot be misused as a form of development or neighborhood character control. This is his word. And then I attach here under 2 reports by your council heritage consultant, the leading heritage consultant, Melbourne, Lover and Chen. They both report standing from 2006, 2007, 2009, 2014, say that the site has no heritage significance, should not be included in the site-specific heritage overlay. So I ask you to adopt that. That's on my report.
That's your presentation. Thank you very much. Councillors, are there any questions of this presenter tonight? There are none. You can return to your...
I'm sorry, I'll ask a question. Thank you.
Councillor Franco.
Thank you, Mr. Eaton. The report that you've attached, so page 3 says properties not recommended for site-specific heritage overlays, 3.3 in this. Where does this come from? Because it says the following properties have been assessed as not being of sufficient heritage significance to warrant an individual.
In our page, 86 was under the 3rd page. Number 86 is highlighted on the 3rd page.
But was this report done for Boroondara Council?
Yes. You see the front page for Boroondara Council?
Ah, right, thank you.
See the 3rd page which is 23. 86 Water Road is part of a non-heritage site. And then on 2014, again, you see the last page, which I highlighted. You say it all. In my opinion, the council staff had ignored his own consultant recommendation. You engage a top heritage consultant, you ignore his comment. Why spend so much money engaging consultant when you don't believe in it?
Thank you.
There does not appear to be any further questions at this point in time. You may return to the gallery. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
I'll now call upon Montserrat Pesamenti to join us at the horseshoe table.
Good evening. My name is Montserrat Pesamenti. I live in Lisson Grove, Hawthorne, and naively, I was going to request for you to make a decision, but I have been told that this has to go to planning panels. Live and learn. I go past that property every day. It's in the Riversdale Ward. It's a lovely little 4-bedroom Victorian place that at the moment is sitting on a dust bowl. They have demolished anything they could demolish. If it goes to planning panels, which will probably be February, March, maybe April, I don't think there'll be anything left of the property in the condition it is now. So I would request one of your enforcement officers and my ward councillor to go and have a good look at what has been left of this lovely, I think it's a unique little place because most properties in the area where I live, which I live on Heritage also, and all the others on Wattle Road, they bigger properties. This is a little jewel of 4 bedrooms, which I would say that it was some, I don't know, some non-very wealthy German person that built the place. It has a very significant 2 stories terrace houses next to it, which again is very, very peculiar from the area and is only 2 doors from Glenferrie Road. So I think it is worth saving it. But as I said no to the thing, innocently thinking you could make a decision tonight. But I am told that it has to go to planning panels, which if that's what happens, that's what happens. Thanks for your time, and it's not my last time here because I do like to get involved.
Thank you for your presentation. Councillors, are there any questions of this presenter tonight? There are none. Thank you very much, Ms. Pittaventi. I now call upon Richard Arbon to join us at the horseshoe table.
Thank you, councillors, for this opportunity to talk, and thank you for undertaking the heritage study. My name is Richard Arbon and I'm from Camberwell. We hope the community will finally see number 86 Wattle Road protected after many years of requesting conservation of this special Hawthorn street that holds so much history and so many well-designed period homes. The study provides us with new information and describes the house as having an unusually high level of integrity and intactness, and says it is a fine early representative example of its type. It makes it clear that it's also important because it's in its original garden setting, notwithstanding the comments just made by the previous person that obviously somebody's just letting the garden go to wreck and ruin. No other house on the street still has that. In fact, it describes the house as virtually unaltered externally since its construction over 140 years ago. 4 council studies now confirm its heritage significance. Number 86 was identified in 3 studies as being of individually significant heritage grade or the equivalent to that grading system today. So in 1993, 1996, 2012, and now in 2023, we have confirmation by 4 heritage experts. Local historians have also identified the house of historic interest and included number 86 in the Wattle Road Heritage Walk that the Hawthorn Historical Society has been publishing since the 1990s. Excuse me. The Society only creates walks for the most significant historical and architecturally fine streets, and the fact that there is a Wattle Road walk tells you that the community has long held this to be a heritage street. Perhaps we should be using Heritage Criterion G, which is about the connection local groups feel to places to protect this street. It's a thought. A past mayor and councillor of Hawthorn built and lived in the house. Charles Edgerton had the house built in the 1880s, and was mayor in 1891 to 92. He was a successful printer. A pallbearer at the time of his funeral in 1908 was the famous engineer, politician and philanthropist George Swinburne, who obviously played a key part in the educational pride in the city, or the educational structure in the city. The house holds much Hawthorn history and is a fine architectural example. We should conserve it. We appreciate that Burundara needs to provide new homes, and I understand the street has provided at least 100 new homes in the last 10 years for Hawthorn, so it's been doing its bit for densification. There are many well-designed period heritage places in this quiet street that make it stand out as an obviously unusual historic place. However, somehow Wattle Road has not yet received the protection it deserves. We hope number 86 can be the start of conservation of this street and that you will support its protection.
You completed? Thanks very much. Councillors, are there any questions of this submitter tonight? There are none. Thank you very much. I now call upon Andrew Nunn to join us at the horseshoe table.
Welcome, councillors, new and old. I think this whole discussion around Wattle Road's gone through the council for some years. Probably important just to
Can we start with, sorry, Mr Nunn, can we start with your name and the suburb which you
Andrew
live?
Nunn, 78 Wattle Road, Hawthorn.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, councillors. Look, Wattle Road is, or Weinberg Road is one of the most distinct and historical roads in Hawthorn. It was the small road that ran from the punt, was the entry to Hawthorn, had vineyards, and this house represents the end of the road to get to the toll house next to it, which was part of that historical entry point. I'd just like to talk about these studies. I mean, I thank my previous speaker who's done all the work for me, actually. But the Loveland Chen study was flawed. It was, I think, politically motivated because what had happened is there was pressure politically to develop Hawthorn, and they decided to keep Manningtree Road and Lisson Grove and give them heritage status. Wattle Road did not get that. There were 40 houses declassified in that particular report, and therefore we've had playing catch up since then. So this study, the Wattle Valley Road, the Wattle Road study is critical to trying to sort these issues out. 86 stands out. I live next door to it. Just to go through a few issues which are very nicely covered by our officers. Look, the general opposition, I'm sorry, I don't understand it. I live in the street, I'm perplexed. In terms of the debacle of 76, we had 500 people who objected or wrote a petition to the government. I knew most of them. They knew the house. There's no way that 59 people has come from our street. Absolutely. Now, having said that, I understand there's a disparity of areas these objections are coming from. Fair enough. You have to accept them. However, there's a commonality of phraseology, and I'd love to run some AI through these and see where they've actually come from. What I'm saying is there is a concerted approach to this. Now, whether that's related to this being a test case for heritage and development, I don't know. Now, the opposition due to constraints placed on the property owner. Look, the property owner bought the auction in full knowledge that it was under heritage discussion and had been on heritage lists. I brought it up at the auction, so I can tell you that was the case. And the important thing is that we're told at the last meeting in June that this was going to be a dwelling, a private dwelling. It isn't. The house is 144 years old. It could easily be fixed up, and it's a beautiful house, as has been mentioned. So I would argue that we have to go through a due process and make sure that it's properly protected. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Nunn. If you just wait for a moment. Councillors, are there any questions of this presenter? There are none. Thank you very much for your presentation tonight. We'll now move to Christina Brannigan, if you can join us at the table.
Okay, good evening, councillors and officers. I'm Christina Brannigan. I live in Camberwell, but I have also lived in Hawthorn previously. So I want to speak tonight about the importance of protection of this house for the proper conservation of the whole of this historic street, and also for the impact of the loss of this important house, if it were to go, the impact it would have on nearby residents. And we can see from the image there, thanks for putting it up. So at number 86 is the house in the centre there. So it's been accepted by several of council's own studies that there are over 45 potentially heritage grade houses on Wattle Road. Unfortunately, they don't think they can create a precinct. But what we do know is that the recent heritage studies confirmed, again, that there are over 20 individually significant grade houses on Wattle Road and 2 further heritage precincts at Wattle Grove and Finchley Court. So the 2023 Independent Heritage Assessment has provided new information. It's now seeking to protect 15 individually significant houses and, interestingly, to protect some important smaller dwellings, which are mid-century flats and 1950s flats and some small Victorian cottages in Wattle Grove. So, you know, lo and behold, we'd have some small homes in that area where we're seeing things get more and more expensive. So 20 individually significant houses on any residential narrow quiet street in Melbourne is a pretty clear indicator we're dealing with a remarkable street, we think. And what you can see in this image, these are actually the neighbouring houses to 86 Wattle Road. Some of them are protected, some of them aren't. But really 86 is an integral house that helps to show the heritage nature of the architecture in the street and the story of this part of Hawthorn. And so I do think its loss would seriously undermine the streetscape. So I respect people's views, but I can't agree with some objectors that it's a place that's less worthy than others nearby. It's a really historic, well-built, aesthetically valuable house that really only needs a small amount of careful, caring restoration, which is what many other people in the streets have done. Lots of people who live on the street have spent time and money restoring their homes to make this part of the street a real heritage gem, and to come in and benefit from that wonderful period character, but potentially rip out something that completely is in character, to my mind, is a very uncommunity-minded thing to consider. And we all have some responsibility, I believe, for our impact on our neighbours and to share the space we live in. As a previous speaker said, I understand that the property owners on Wattle Road were advised in mid-2021 that a heritage study was underway, and at the auction it was quite clear that this was a property that was likely to be protected. If we could just go very briefly to the next slide, we can see examples of the other houses on the street that councils, oh sorry, we already have, I got it wrong. These are examples of the houses on the street that council is seeking to protect as individually significant. So I hope you agree that, you know, they are very much worthy of protection. And council has done their experts have done a great job in identifying some houses on the street that hopefully we can protect. So I hope you'll all agree that they are worthy of protection and that number 86 is too. It really is an integral house in the streetscape, and its loss would really undermine the street.
Thank you for your presentation. Councillors, questions? There are none. Thank you very much for your presentation. As that exhausts all the speakers tonight, I'll now return to the officers for matters arising.
Thank you, Chair. And through you, regarding previous studies of Wattle Road that have looked at 86 Wattle Road, Council acknowledges that there have been a number of studies of that property that are available to view on Council's website. Those previous studies dating back to the original Hawthorn Heritage Study of 1993. There was a B and C grade review in 2007 and 2009. There were precinct studies in 2012, and there was the municipal-wide heritage gap study in 2020. Have all looked at this area and areas in Hawthorn and have consistently not recommended this property be put into a heritage overlay. Council, as part of this new study, has investigated the property again, and Council's heritage consultant has viewed the property in new light and found some elements that were not identified in previous studies or that were discounted or degraded in previous studies, and have highlighted them in the new citation that's been prepared, and submitted that to Council, and Council has decided to go through the planning scheme amendment process to test that citation to determine whether it stands up and makes the grounds for heritage significance for that property. As part of the authorisation request to DTP, the Department of Transport and Planning, officers there asked Council for evidence that new evidence had been found about this property, and that they raised questions about some of the previous studies that have been undertaken and the reasons that they had not recommended this property and why this new citation disagreed with those previous studies, and Council provided that additional information to DTP, and that satisfied DTP that this property should be put through the amendment process to test those findings, and that's what we're doing as part of this process. In terms of partial demolition of the property, there was a Section 29A application for demolition of the entire property that was lodged in 2023. That was refused. Following that, there was a subsequent demolition application for partial demolition of the property, which council officers worked with the applicant to get that to a point where the extent of the property that was being demolished was determined to not have a detrimental impact on the heritage significance of the property. We're also aware that there have been some questions raised by people in the street as to what is going on with that demolition and whether it is complying with the requirements, and there have been officers from the building department go out to determine that that is being carried out properly. So we have been inspecting that property throughout the process. Also, in terms of the submissions that have been received and where they came from and who they made them and the numbers of them, when considering submissions made to an amendment, council must accept any submission made to an amendment. There's no grounds under which council can say this is not a submission we're going to accept, no matter who makes it, no matter where they're from, no matter what their involvement or non-involvement or anything like that is. That we have to accept every submission and consider it on its merits. When officers are going through submissions, what we are considering are the points raised in those submissions. We're not making recommendations based on the number of submissions or whether one particular viewpoint has more submissions than another or where particular submissions are coming from. We respond to the points raised in those submissions. So that's, and whether they raise flaws in the citation, we respond to those. Whether they object to the process, we respond to those. And we make recommendations based on whether those submissions, in our opinion and in our heritage consultant's opinion, undermine the grounds we have put forward for heritage significance of the property. That's the assessment of submissions that we do as officers, and the recommendation we're putting to you tonight is that those submissions should be referred to an independent planning panel, which is a third-party body which will consider all the submissions against the requirements of the Planning Practice Note for heritage properties, the requirements of the Planning Environment Act, the evidence provided by heritage experts, and the submissions made by all those who have made written submissions and all those who decide to appear before the panel. And the panel will then make a recommendation back to council as to whether the case for heritage significance for this property has been made sufficiently. I believe that's all, and I'll take any questions.
Thanks very much. Councillor Hollingsworth.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for articulating everything you've just said, and you've already answered, I think, two of my questions. So you've clearly emphasised that this is an independent panel. It meets the criteria put forward by our state government, and no one from Burundara Council is on the panel. Is that correct?
Through you, Mr Chair, the panel hasn't actually been appointed yet. But yes, one of the grounds for appointing the panel will be determining that the chair of the panel does not have any conflict of interest with this matter or any interest in this matter.
Right, thank you. And just one more question. If council were of the will to support the recommendation, are you able to advise approximate time frame of when the panel would be likely to convene?
Through you, Chair. Yes, the panel dates have been preset, in that there will be a directions hearing held in the first week of February, and the panel hearing will be in the first week of March.
And sorry, approximately then, would that be likely to be 1 week, 2 weeks before determinations are made available?
The time frame from the panel to release their report back to council is dependent on the number of people that sit on the panel, so whether there are one or two. If there is one panel member, then it will be 20 days after the panel, the report will be provided to council, and after that, council has 10 days to release the report publicly. If there are two members, then it will be 30 days for the panel to release the report, and then still 10 days for council. So it'll be 30 to 40 days looking at that.
Right. Thank you.
Councillor Osborne-Smith.
Thank you. A couple of questions through you, Chair, if I may. It appears from what we've learnt tonight, we've had studies of affecting this property in 93, 96, 2006, 2009, 2012, 2014 and 2023. It seems an extraordinary amount of attention in this precinct. I'm curious to know, will this panel process be likely, in your opinion, to end this very long journey of assessment of this property? And is there any assurances you can give us that that may be the end of it?
Through you, Mr. Chair. Yes, it is true that the investigation of properties in this street has not been to a panel hearing before. So these findings have been internal to council and have not been tested. This would be a level of consideration that has not been put onto properties in this street before. So if the panel were to come, entirely hypothetically talking now, if the panel were to come back and say that this heritage investigation does not stack up and we do not believe that this property should go into a heritage overlay, it would be, council would need to find new information on the property before heritage could be pursued again. That said, this will not be a finding that will stand in perpetuity. In 10, 20 more years, if this property is still in sufficient intactness, given the likely attrition of buildings and the increased rarity of this property it would be in, it would be entirely possible that it could be looked at again in the future.
Well said, thank you. And as a follow-up question, if I may, Chair, through you, Chair, the panel hearing, is it a broad remit that's going to look at other properties in Wattle Road or just this one property? And I guess if the answer to that is no, what can we see ahead that gives us some comfort that perhaps this whole precinct may be reviewed?
Through you, Chair. Yes, this panel hearing will be only looking at 86 Wattle Road. It could conceivably look at the methodology of the report that gave rise to the recommendation for 86 Wattle Road, which also gave rise to the recommendation for the other properties, but that would be technically beyond the remit of what the panel was being asked to look at. The remainder of properties in the street that have been recommended for heritage significance are the subject of an authorisation request that is currently sitting with DTP. So that would be a second amendment process that would include the remaining properties, and which would be subject to the same amendment process.
And one final question, if I may, Chair. These properties that are in limbo, sometimes for many years, often cause great angst to residents about their condition, which can often be left to deteriorate, often to a point of tremendous decline. I'm curious to understand what assurances council can give us about maintaining the property, in particular its structural integrity, its garden, its fences, its security and the like, whilst this process is being undertaken. Thank you.
Through you, Chair. In the case of 86 Wattle Road, that property is now subject to an interim heritage overlay. So there is a heritage overlay on the property right now. It does have an expiry date, which is why it is interim, but that means that a planning permit is required for any buildings and works, for any extension and for any demolition. There are provisions in place for what is termed demolition by neglect, whereby you allow a property to fall apart over time to the point where it becomes structurally unsound and can be demolished. That is something that council can pursue and enforce, that a property is maintained to a sufficient level and not be allowed to fall apart as a way of demolition. The remaining properties are not subject to interim heritage overlays at the moment. There is a method through the Building Act whereby report and consent is required by council for demolition of any property. And as part of the response to that application, council can say that, no, we will not allow you to, we don't give consent for demolition of this property because it is the subject of an application for an amendment to put a heritage overlay on. So we are suspending your application to demolish and we'll seek an interim heritage overlay. That's the trigger for council to step in when the heritage process is underway.
Councillor, does that exhaust your questions?
Not quite, Chair, and without labouring the point, I'm less concerned about applications to demolish the property. I'm more concerned about maintaining its integrity in the coming months and years ahead. Am I correct in understanding that if neighbours are concerned about the deteriorating condition of the property, whether it's broken tiles on the roof that may be leading to leaking inside, whether it's a garden overgrowing or becoming decrepit, is that sufficient grounds for them to raise concerns with your team and for action to be taken?
to preserve the property?
Chair, I might just give a little bit of a broader answer to the question because it highlights one of the real difficulties in the planning system with heritage properties. And I think I've indicated in this chamber before that planning controls, and in particular heritage controls, are quite powerful and strong in terms of what they prevent or protect. But what they are quite weak at, or what they don't do, is actually oblige a property owner to maintain or do something positive. So they stop something, but they don't require something. And it's a concern in the planning system where there are heritage properties that are left and are neglected. There was some changes to the Planning and Environment Act that sought to include provisions that enable councils to take action where there's effective demolition or destruction of a property by neglect. Now, these provisions have not really been tested in any significant way, and this council is actually endeavouring to test that type of provision in the situation for a heritage property that was destroyed by arson at 7 Mangara Road. And we have a matter sitting in the Department of Transport and Planning and before the Planning Minister awaiting authorisation to consider an amendment to the planning scheme to deal with that destruction under that broader provision. And it will be a test case for how other councils may be able to use these provisions in neglect situations. So this is an evolving space, and it's something that we are well and truly aware of, and certainly those in the heritage industry are watching carefully. We do have general provisions in the local law that may deal with things like fire hazards and unsightliness and unkept, but they are not provisions that really get to the heart of someone doing proactive maintenance of a heritage property.
Thank you for that explanation.
Councillor Franco.
Thank you, Chair. You mentioned, or officers mentioned that we have a number of properties on Wattle Road awaiting or sitting with the Minister or DTP, but 86 Wattle Road is with us now and did get permission to go forward. Could you advise, did we put them to the Minister? My memory now, it's been 4 years since I think I've been looking at this road and I can't remember all the events, but why did we get approval for 86 to go forward and we didn't receive it for the other properties? Because ideally it would be best to have dealt with them all together, but did they go up to the Minister altogether and this one came back, or did they go up separately? I just can't recall.
Through you, Mr Chair. They were sent up separately. 86 Wattle Road was sent up in advance of the remainder of the street as a result of the application for demolition that was lodged. We were informed by DTP that unless that application for an interim heritage overlay was followed by a request for authorisation for a permanent amendment, the interim would not be approved. So it was essentially fast-tracked to get there quicker.
And do you recall how long the others have been with the department?
The authorisation request was sent in October 2023.
Thank you.
Councillor Ballieu.
Thank you, and through you, Chair. I actually visited the property on the weekend and I was a bit stunned to see the state of it. It is nothing like the images that have been put forward to us tonight. It's in a real state of disrepair. And following on from Councillor Mal Osborne-Smith's queries, I just wanted to find out if any council staff have been out to the property to assess or monitor the possibility of demolition for neglect, particularly in relation to the garden, which is a compelling part of the underlying heritage considerations.
Through you, Chair. To my knowledge, no council staff have been out to specifically determine whether the property is being demolished by neglect. There have been staff go out in response to a removal of a tree in the backyard and I believe some questions around teenagers gathering in the backyard, but not specifically looking at the demolition by neglect. I will note that the specific plantings in the front garden would not be protected under the heritage overlay. There's no tree or vegetation controls proposed to be activated as part of this. So the specific part of the front yard that is identified as significant is that the layout of that front path, the circular path, not necessarily the plantings that go around it.
Thank you.
Councillor Hollingsworth.
Thank you. I'll be very quick. I know I've already spoken. Sorry, just for a point of clarification, I think you might have mentioned before the studies in 93, 96, 2012 and 23 weren't rated the house as individually significant. My understanding was it was from the expert assessors at the time, but it was council that didn't move with the recommendations. I just wanted to seek clarification. I was going to say fairly confident that 2023 was definitely individually significant. Yeah.
Through you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, 2023 is this study. So yes, this one is recommended individually significant. There was a previous study that looked at a precinct for Wattle Road and Lisson Grove that eventually recommended that there be a precinct for Lisson Grove, which is now in the planning scheme, and that flagged a number of individual properties in Wattle Road to be investigated for individually significant, as whether they were individually significant. That study was undertaken a few years later, and those properties at that time were found by that study to not be individually significant. So there has not been a study which has flagged these properties as individually significant and recommended that they should be put into the heritage overlay until the 2023 study.
23. All right, thank you.
Councillor Sinfield.
Thank you, Chair. And through you, perhaps to Mr Brennan, a follow-up question to the one raised by Councillor Baillieu regarding the attendance by officers at the subject site. I thought I heard earlier that officers had attended to ensure that the fabric had not been adversely affected in response to the subsequent Section 29A or the modified Section 29A demolition application. But now we're learning something different. I'm seeking clarification.
Through you, Mr Chair. Sorry, I misspoke on that, Councillor. My understanding is that there has been an inspection by the building department or a request to the building surveyor to substantiate that the demolition is in accordance with the demolition that was permitted by the building permit.
For clarity, officers have attended in relation to that. Not just a request for officers to attend, but can I have some certainty, perhaps from the Director, that officers have in fact attended?
I will need to follow that up. I would not be able to give you a definitive answer. I'm sorry.
Chair, I can't give you an indication. I don't have that information available at hand.
Thank you. Nothing further.
That seems to have exhausted questions. That being the case, I'll move to say I'm in search of a motion. Councillor Baillieu.
I wish to move the motion, Chair.
This is the time to do that.
I wish to move the motion. Sorry.
Thank you. That's great. Do we have a seconder?
Yes, I'm happy to second, Chair.
Councillor Osborne-Smith, thank you. Is there anyone opposed to the motion as proposed? Fantastic, it's unopposed. Councillor Baillieu, would you like to speak to your motion?
Yes, and through you, Chair, and I just want to thank all the speakers that submit to the council tonight. I am happy to say I will be supporting the motion as recommended by council officers. Wattle Road has been subject to a long and storied history around its heritage status. And when it comes to this property in particular, I think the least we can do is give it one final independent, fair review at a panel before we decide ultimately on its fate. I do note that there were 109 submissions on this property in relation to this motion correction. 59 of these actually came from people outside of Boroondara. Of the 50 submissions from Boroondara, the overwhelming majority are in favour of the motion. I was surprised that despite the significant community interest in this property, not a single individual has actually reached out to me as the ward councillor. So in the interim, I decided I'd go and speak to the community myself. I've called many people along Wattle Road. I've door-knocked the road. I've had briefings with the director, Mr. Scott Walker, and I'm satisfied that there is significant community interest in justifying that this property be referred to a third party for heritage assessment. I have visited this property and I know that it is in a state that is vastly different from what's been put on the screen tonight. The images put on the screen tonight come from at least December 2020. So unless the property has significantly deteriorated in the last 3 years or so, I do worry about its current condition and the quality of the efforts to maintain the property pending its review. I do encourage all of my fellow councillors tonight to support this motion, give this property its last fair and independent review before we decide on its fate. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Baillieu. As this motion is unopposed, Councillor Osborne-Smith, I tend to move forward to putting the motion, unless you've got a strong objection.
No objection. I endorse Councillor Baillieu's comments and I would be delighted to second it. Thank you.
Thank you. Terrific. I will now put this motion. All in favour? It is unanimous and carried. Thank you very much. Moving to item 3.3 on the agenda, 335 Camberwell Road, Camberwell. Construction of a 10-storey mixed-use building containing 69 apartments, PP24/0440. Tonight, the officers first, Scott Walker will have a few words, and then he'll hand over to Kelly Caparoso, Principal Urban Planner. Thank you, officers.
Thanks, Chair. I would like to just give a little bit of context to this application as a brief introduction before I hand over to Kelly Caparoso, our Principal Planner, who has undertaken the assessment for the application. And it's to put in context some of the moving parts and things that are happening from a strategic and planning scheme point of view for the Camberwell Junction Activity Centre. The existing Camberwell Junction structure plan, or the old former structure plan that has some reference in the planning scheme, goes right back to 1993. And what we ultimately have in terms of the planning rules around the Camberwell Junction in the zones and any other relevant overlays is quite limited in terms of the guidance that's provided. There have been subsequent structure plans that haven't been included or referenced in any particular planning provisions within the scheme. And then we bring ourselves forward to March of this year, in which a new Camberwell Junction structure and place plan was adopted. And that structure and place plan went through extensive consultation and analysis and research in the Camberwell Junction area to understand what is the appropriate guiding built form outcomes that we would be expecting or anticipating throughout Camberwell. So that really underpinned then a proposal that this council put forward to the Minister for Planning with an authorisation request to support a design and development overlay that would give guidance to development outcomes on the site. Now that authorisation request is still sitting with the Minister for Planning. We then have had a subsequent process as part of the planning housing reforms announced by the government in 2023 to bring forward controls for 10 pilot activity centres, and Camberwell being one of those. So in August this year, we had a plan put out by the government that also put forward built form controls or built form guidance for the activity centre, generally consistent with what we had put forward in our structure and place plan in March this year, and we anticipate being generally consistent with the design and development overlay that we put in place. However, there will not be a design and development overlay put forward by the state government in the final controls that they will bring to Camberwell. They will have what's called a built form overlay. We've seen a draft version of that overlay, but we don't know what the final version looks like yet. So we've got these different moving parts where they've got slightly different forms of control, but no final control. And that's the context that sits behind us when we've undertaken the assessment of this planning permit application. So it's very difficult when we talk about compliance or what this proposal meets. However, what you will hear us talk about and say in the assessment is that it meets the aspirations and guidance provided by the Camberwell Structure and Place Plan. So that vision, aspirations and essential built form expectations is what we're saying this proposal meets when we come to the detailed assessment of the proposal. We do have elements in the planning scheme that look at clauses that give specific guidelines around apartment developments in activity centres, and so there will be reference to those sorts of controls as well. So I just want to give that context that that sets the background for where we're at in the moving pieces around the activity centre. I'll now hand over to Ms Caparaso to give the further detailed introduction to the item.
Thank you. Through you, Chair, I present UPDC item 3.3 for the planning permit application for a mixed-use development at 335 Camberwell Road, Camberwell. It is proposed to construct a 10-storey building with ground floor retail and 69 apartments above. Car parking for 212 car parking spaces and 107 bicycle spaces is proposed in the 3 basement levels. The application was placed on public notice and 60 objections were received. Council officers submit the proposed development is appropriate and complies with the relevant planning policies for the following reasons. The proposal is consistent with the development expectations set out in the Camberwell Structure and Place Plan, which was adopted by Council in March 2024. This plan anticipates significant growth in this area, including higher density housing. The 10-storey building height complies with the height specified in the Camberwell Structure and Place Plan and the draft design and development overlay. The proposal is an exemplary architectural design which is visually interesting and contextually responsive. The proposal adopts high-quality materials and is supported by Council's urban designer. The proposal has adopted substantial side and rear setbacks, which both respond to the amenity of the adjoining dwellings, as well as providing a high level of amenity for future residents. The proposal is compliant with Clause 58, which relates to apartment developments. The proposal achieves a best practice environmental sustainable design outcome with a best scorecard of 65% and a 7-star energy rating. Initiatives such as solar panels, rainwater tanks and EV charging has been included. It is recommended that Council issue a notice of decision to grant a planning permit subject to the conditions detailed in the officer recommendation. Thank you.
Tonight, 3 members of the public with us have indicated they'd like to do a submission. 1 is against the proposal and 2 support it. In a moment, I shall announce your names and ask you to come forward to the horseshoe table, but I shall remind you in advance that of the 3-minute speaking limit, and you need to start with your name and the suburb from which you hail. If I can start by calling John McDonald.
Good evening, councillors. My name is John McDonald and I live in the catchment area of Camberwell. The amenity of the civic precinct and the adjoining residential area to the north will be compromised by the scale and massing of the proposed development. The proposed development towers over the adjoining Ebony apartment building alongside. That's an appropriate scale of 5 stories, which is a transition to the lower 1 or 2-storey residential area to the north. Actually, the Ebony building is only 4 stories on Camberwell Road, and then it steps well back before rising another story. The proposed development has 4 stories on Camberwell Road, but then only 2 minimal setbacks and rising to a height of 10 stories, which means we will read the bulk of this prominent building mass on Camberwell Road. A major issue is that at a height of 10 stories, the proposed development will compromise the prominence of the Town Hall Tower diagonally opposite. This major landmark in the civic precinct is visible from many vantage points around Camberwell. The tower is a memorable component of the Heritage Town Hall, and it is important that it remains an iconic feature in the area. The proposed development will cast long shadows over Camberwell Road, affecting the local urban amenity, and traffic movement will be intensified. Now, whilst the impact of one development is difficult to measure, the lack of parking and traffic intensity in Camberwell would become far more problematic if similar sized developments were replicated. And we have enough trouble parking around the shopping precinct at present. Most critically, this project sets an overdeveloped precedent in terms of height and bulk in this sector of Camberwell Road if it proceeds in its current form. So what changes could be made to address some of these concerns? I would suggest reducing the height to conform to a height closer to the adjoining apartment building, and obviously something between what's proposed and the Ebony building may be appropriate. 10 stories will be very dominant, particularly for this end of Camberwell Road up from the junction. Deeper setbacks should be created to soften its visual impact. The design presently only has minor setbacks to Camberwell Road elevation. Provide a wider and more protective weatherproof canopy to Camberwell Road. The current canopy is only minimal in cover to the footpath, I understand. Council should consider height amendments to the scheme. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillors, do we have any queries of this presenter tonight? There are none. Thank you, Mr. McDonald. You can, they're popping up all over the place. Councillor Osborne-Smith.
Thank you for your presentation, Mr. McDonald. Your comment about the canopy over the footpath, could you just repeat that concern, please? I didn't quite understand it.
It appears to be fairly narrow. If it could be widened, it would provide more cover to the street. It's difficult to tell from the planning drawings, but it doesn't appear to be wide enough to provide.
You're talking about the veranda, effectively, right? It's narrow. It doesn't.
It appears to be narrow, and whether it's continuous, I'm not sure, but it appears to be a little too narrow.
Okay,
thank you. Detail, yeah.
Thank you.
There doesn't appear to be any further questions. Thank you very much for your submission tonight. I now call upon Mr. William Pearce to join us.
Good evening.
If you you just start with your name and where you reside?
My name's Will Pearce, and I'm a consultant town planner and a director of a firm called Human Habitats, and our office is in Docklands.
Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak tonight on behalf of Angle Civic, who's my client in this matter. You'll shortly hear from Mr. Lachlan Gibson, who is my client and also wishes to speak to you tonight. He will talk about his aspirations for the project and his past projects in Burundara and the quality of what they achieve. We also have members of our project team here, including our architect, Tristan Wong, who's designed a truly beautiful building. Together, we're here to advise that the recommendation before you tonight is very well considered, and we're here to support that recommendation. It's a result of significant work on behalf of the Town Planning Department and also experts within Council. The report acknowledges that the project architect and landscape architect have taken inspiration from the local context, carefully crafting a proposal into what will be a really positive feature of the Camberwell Road streetscape. That being said, the proposal before you tonight is not exactly pushing the boundaries when you look at what is coming and what has already been approved by this council. Not only is the proposal compliant with the key metrics in the structure plan, particularly building height, the number of stories, but it's also compliant with what we understand is the incoming planning framework, and that's referenced, and Mr. Walker spoke about that tonight. It's been referenced in the report as well. The key things are that where the proposal is compliant is in terms of the number of stories. It has very, very generous floor-to-floors, which will offer significant amenity and provide a home-like quality for these apartments. With changes recommended by Council's urban design expert, the street wall will sit comfortably within the street and will largely match the ebony building, and with some little tweaks to the edges suggested by the Council urban designer, that'll improve. Setbacks to neighbours, particularly when you look at what's coming in terms of Clause 58, are extraordinarily generous. The northern lot to Butler Street has been identified as a communal garden, so there'll be no built form in that space, no significant built form in that space. And there's significant greening around the edges of the site and up the building. You only need to go to page 169 of the report and you'll see some comments from Council's urban designer which talk about the proposal as an outstanding design outcome that will set a superior precedent in the Camberwell Junction Activity Centre. And this should give you confidence as councillors. The proposal is consistent with the existing and also incoming planning framework. It's also something you should take comfort with is the recommendation before you tonight, which is thorough and well considered, and we implore you to support that. And I'm happy to take any questions you may have.
Thank you. Councillors, questions? Councillor Hollingsworth.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for your presentation. If this application is supported by Council this evening, are you able to speak on behalf of your client of the anticipated timeframe of when this project would likely proceed?
Well, my client will shortly be speaking to you. Their plan is to proceed as soon as possible. They see a real demand for the product that they that they put forward, and but you'll also be able to ask the same question of Mr. Gibson.
Right. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Councillor Baillieu.
Thank you. This is a pretty simple question. The size of the rooms, particularly 1- and 2-bedroom apartments, how big are the bedrooms themselves? It's not quite clear to me from the diagrams.
Which bedroom?
Just say on any of the 2-bedroom apartments.
Oh, look, I don't have dimension plans in front of me. What I will say is the absolute bare minimum bedroom size under Clause 58 is 3 metres by 3 metres, and there would be not one of those rooms within this building. The bedrooms here are substantial, and that is targeting a Camberwell-style downsizer who's accustomed to having a lot of space, and but perhaps there's someone busily looking at the more detailed plans in the background and can feed that through to Mr. Gibson.
I'm very happy with the answer you've given, so thanks.
Councillor Boogie.
Thank you for speaking tonight. I just had a question about the retail space that was at the bottom of the building. It seems to have quite a large footprint. Is it envisaged that that would be used for some particular purpose?
So we are in a commercial one zone, which allows for a variety of retail spaces, and that will be up to the permit applicant to decide how they ultimately lease that space out. My understanding, though, is that the space is designed and targeted towards a hospitality type retail space. So, yeah, ideally a restaurant or a large cafe or something like that. But as I said, I'm not committing to that tonight because we are in a commercial one zone where a range of commercial uses are as of right. So hopefully that answers your question.
Yes, thank you. But I also just wondered whether 3 car park spaces for such a large retail space was sufficient.
Yeah, so in the traffic report, that was considered sufficient, and that's because there is ample parking within the streetscape there. The other thing as well is it's very difficult with retail parking underneath a building like this to encourage visitors to use those car spaces. So what we can do is provide key staff of that space with a car park. And obviously for servicing and things like that as well, deliveries and whatnot.
Great, thank you.
Councillor Osborne-Smith.
Thanks for your presentation. Quick question on building materials. The officer's report referred to high quality materials. I'm looking at your southwest elevation here and your rendering, which shows a brick type material. Could you just elaborate on what we might end up seeing here? At the end of the day, the interface of the building with the public realm is of most importance to our residents. So could you just elaborate on that, please?
Look, that might be something that Mr. Gibson can talk to. From my view is that the materials that have been selected have gone through a process of significant review and testing by Council's expert urban designer. She's really challenged us on those and what we can deliver. Predominantly, the materials that have been selected have been around masonry and concrete and referencing the civic centre opposite, which have those sort of really solid materials. But I think that Mr. Gibson is well placed to talk about that because he actually delivers projects, and we all know that render versus reality is there's sometimes a difference there, but not with their projects. Or if there is a difference, it's better.
That finishes your questions, Councillor?
Yes, thank you.
Thanks very much. Thank you, Mr. Pearce. That seems to have exhausted all the questions of you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I now call upon Lockie Gibson to join us at the table.
Lockie Gibson from Angle. We are the permit applicant for this project.
If you just mention an address of some sort.
Yes, 76 Harold Street in Camberwell. Yep. Thank you for the opportunity to speak tonight. we are accepting of the officer's recommendation and encourage the committee to endorse that to help us enable to deliver our 7th project in Boroondara, which is obviously a municipality that's we've done a lot of work in over the years. Over the past decade, we've been fortunate enough to receive a number of awards for our projects, including 2 Urban Design Awards from Boroondara, one in 2018 for our Maple project, and more recently for our Fenwick project, which in addition to that award won numerous state, national and even an international award, which we're incredibly proud of. And the reason I think that's really important to mention is that they're awards for what we've actually delivered and built, which is incredibly important compared to what we represent. I think whenever we are fortunate enough to win, accolades like that, it's really down to the selection of our team. So I think for us, the key is picking people that are absolutely best in class and at the top of their game. So for this project, we've got Andy Fergus as the urban designer, who sets up the principles from the get-go. Tristan Wong, who's an incredibly talented designer, established his practice a little over a year ago, and I think that you'll hear a lot more of his name. And then Marla and Amanda Oliver on the landscape, who have done not just amazing multi-res and public realm projects, but very proficient in single home residential landscapes as well. So in addition to the best-in-class design team, industry best practice for ESD as well, which Will alluded to, which is consistent with all of our current projects. So I think in terms of the physical attributes of the site, without going over all of them, I think one thing that's quite notable is the landscape setting. In a major activity centre, our site coverage is 58%, which is below what you'd expect in a general residential zone. Highly unusual, and I think we've got the significant communal garden out the back, 6 to 10 metre landscape setbacks on the periphery, which are significant. The occupants will benefit from incredible internal amenity, 3 metre high ceilings, a high proportion of facade, which is the key to great floor plans, a lot of cross-flow ventilation, and then materiality alluded to earlier. I think extremely honest materials with high longevity and in little need of maintenance, which is crucial in a multi-res setting. Then I think most importantly, the site itself, I think there's a significant size being 3,800 square metres, but also its location within the civic precinct, which is the heart of Camberwell. We've got council's offices, the town hall, St John's Church, the Basilica, Camberwell South Primary, Lower Reserve. So I think for us, this is by far and away the most high-profile project that we've undertaken to date.
Mr. Gibson, could you move towards wrapping up your presentation?
Yep, that will conclude my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Now, councillors, this is your chance to ask questions of Mr. Gibson. So first we have Councillor Hollingsworth.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Gibson, for explaining all that you've just done. You can probably preempt my question with regard to if this was supported by council. Are you in a position to give an estimate of likelihood of timing to start the construction?
Yep, so I think the answer that everyone wants to hear is tomorrow, but these things do take time. So I think, from an investment perspective, it's millions of dollars to sort of undertake the next phase of design and sales. So that's something that we've obviously not spent any money on until we understand our position on the permit. But should we be successful and receive a permit, we would look to go quickly next year. Realistically, I'd love to have a crystal ball and tell you how long it'll take to get enough pre-sales, but it'll take at least a year to achieve enough pre-sales to get into construction. But I'd love to be starting construction in 2026, and it will be a 2-year build, being a significant size building.
Thank you.
Councillor Abuki.
Thank you for your presentation. Talking about sales, is this going to be pitched as a high-end luxury development? Is there a mix of affordable housing, or is it looking, like a really luxe offering?
Yeah, it's certainly aimed at the downsizer market. I think, unfortunately, in the current economic environment, the only sort of projects that really are feasible at this point in time are probably, especially in this location, are primarily targeted at the people with a decent amount of money that can afford to buy these apartments. I would love to be able to do. We've done projects in the past where it's 50 apartments and it's a mix of 1 and 2 bedroom apartments, but the reality is that those simply do not stack up and aren't feasible at the moment, and that's why you're sort of not seeing a lot of that being developed, unfortunately.
Okay, thank you. Interesting. Thank you.
Councillor Nolan.
Thank you, Mr. Gibson. Can you just talk me through the car park approach to the building and the roads that approach, how you're getting in and out of those 212 car parks?
Yes, the crossover on Campbell Road, which mimics the location of the existing crossover to the RAIV car park. I think a key sort of misconception around is that the number of car parks sort of increases the number of traffic. I think it's more dictated to by the number of dwellings itself. So it's 69 apartments and 1 cafe. So regardless if we put in 100 cars, 150 cars, 200 cars, the traffic generation would be of a similar amount.
Thank you. So, yeah, okay, thank you.
Thank you for your presentation, Mr. Gibson. That appears to have exhausted questions. Thank you.
Anytime.
I will now return to officers for matters arising.
Thank you. Through you, Chair, just some small areas of clarification, given that the speakers didn't have plans in front of them. In terms of the query about the bedroom sizes, the 2-bedroom apartment, the smallest bedroom is 3 by 3.4, and that doesn't include wardrobe space as well. So that's for the 2-bedroom apartment. In terms of the overshadowing to the public realm, as detailed in the report, there is some overshadowing to the footpath adjacent, and that occurs between 10 and 12, and then from 12 onwards, there's no overshadowing. In terms of the viewpoints to the town hall, those viewpoints haven't been specified in the draft DDO or the structure plan, but it's not anticipated that with the development expectations of the structure plan, they'll be unreasonably reduced, but they haven't been specified and they haven't been looked at. Thank you. Sorry, thank you, through you, Chair. The other question was around the canopy. So the canopy has a dimension of 2.4 metres. Given that this is a main arterial road with a tram stop, you might not be able to extend to the whole edge of the footpath, and it does have a curve where there's a tree as well, so it doesn't extend the whole way across because they're accommodating for that tree that they're putting on Campbell Road. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillors, are there any questions of officers? There are none. That really finalises public submissions. I will now move to seek a motion from the floor.
I'll be pleased to put up a motion.
I think now is the time to put your motion, Councillor.
That motion will be to accept the officer's recommendation.
Do we have a seconder? Councillor Pattis. Happy to second? Yes. Great. Is there any opposition? There isn't. Mr. Osborne-Smith, would you like to speak to your motion?
Yes, I'd be delighted to. Thank you, Chair. And I'd like to spend just a minute or two talking about this project and perhaps in its context, in a broader context. We all know Campbell Junction is growing, and this council has a bold plan to reshape the junction over time to allow, indeed encourage mixed-use, medium-density housing in sensible infill locations around the heart of the activity centre in Camberwell Junction. And as our Director of Urban Places has alluded to, the Camberwell Structure and Place Plan is a well-researched plan, has been developed in consultation with our community and has been informed by detailed background research and analysis. And that plan envisages 1,500 dwellings, providing much needed accommodation to support a growing and changing population, adding around 4,500 residents to our junction area. And these housing targets are logical, calibrated and sustainable. I would say to the objectors, and I know there was one tonight and there have been many more, we understand that change is not always easy for some, and we understand there are legitimate concerns that you may have, and that in particular some of neighbouring residents will be detrimentally impacted. I would like to say though that this project has been very carefully considered by all council officers at the highest level, and it meets all the requirements in terms of height limits, design, development overlays, car parking, ESD and apartment design guidelines. And further, with the changes that have been made and the conditions proposed, we believe that it has the potential to be an outstanding example of a junction development. It is of exciting and interesting contemporary architectural design with its tiered northern balconies and good setbacks from the east to accommodate neighbouring properties. It will be a project important to the visual impact of the area in the Civic Precinct Park and its interplay with the public realm. And so I would just conclude by saying to the applicant, Angle Civic, Mr Gibson, Mr Wong, congratulations on your work to reach this point. We do appreciate, and I hope we appreciate at Council, that it is a long and expensive journey to get to the starting line of a project of this magnitude. We believe this project has the opportunity to be a landmarked one for Camberwell Junction. We ask you to love this project. We ask you to put your heart and soul into it. We ask that you build it to exacting standards, as it will be a legacy, not just for you, but for this city for decades to come. We ask that you work hard to find a fantastic tenant for your retail space that has a public interface that will be used and enjoyed by residents of the junction for years to come. And finally, we ask that you respect your neighbours and the residents and visitors of Camberwell Junction during its construction to minimise impact and to be a good neighbour for this precinct. I commend this motion to my fellow councillors. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Osborne-Smith. Again, I would think we should move directly to putting the motion as it is unopposed. So we shall now do that. All of those in favour of the motion as put? There is no one opposed. It's carried unanimously. Thank you very much, councillors. Okay. We have one objector tonight. Julie Mulhauser. We're right? Yep. Good to go. Okay, everyone. We now move to the final item on our agenda tonight of the core business. Item 3.4, Victorian Government Planning Reforms, December 2024 update. Tonight's presentation will be made by Kristen Williamson, Manager, City Futures. Thank you.
Thank you, and through you, Chair. This report provides an update and an overview of the current Victorian Government Planning Reform Program, including its Activity Centres program and how those reforms impact on Camberwell, the area around the centre, which is now widely known as the catchment, and Burundara more broadly. In September 2023, the Victorian Government released its housing statement with the aim of providing an additional 800,000 dwellings over the next decade. Since its release, the Victorian Government has embarked on a series of planning reforms that represent the most ambitious and far-reaching reform of the planning system since the introduction of the current planning schemes as we know them in the late 1990s. Planning reforms with a direct impact on Boroondara, to which Council has lodged submissions in recent months and that are discussed in the report or summarised in the report, include a submission on Plan for Victoria, which will replace the Metropolitan Planning Strategy Plan for Melbourne that is currently in effect. That submission also included comments on the draft housing targets that the Victorian Government released for all Victorian councils. That submission was made in late August. The Camberwell Junction Activity Centre Plan, to which Council lodged a submission on the 26th of September 2024. That submission provided support for the plan for the activity centre core, so the commercial area, given its consistency with Council's adopted structure and place plan, but it raised concerns regarding the implementation of the walkable catchment around the centre. In addition to Camberwell, we also lodged a submission on the activity centre's draft planning controls, as the government is proposing to use newly developed planning controls for these centres and the catchments around them. We provided in principle support for the built form overlay, but there were some concerns about the specific content and drafting of those provisions. And again, there was concern expressed over the implementation of the walkable catchment zone. In early September, there was a submission lodged on proposed RES code reforms. So RES code is the other planning provisions that our statutory planners use to assess multi-dwelling developments or single-dwelling development applications, so apartment development and so forth. That submission expressed concerns regarding the deemed to comply approach and the effective removal of neighbourhood character as a consideration in the planning permit assessment process. And lastly, there was a submission lodged, we didn't lodge a submission on this one, that we haven't had the opportunity yet, is on the announcement that there will be 50 new activity centres created throughout metropolitan Melbourne, and 3 of those on the first batch of 25 that have been announced are located in Boroondara. That includes Hawthorn, Glenferrie and Auburn train stations, and a yet-to-be-defined catchment around those. So we haven't had the opportunity to make any submissions on that, but there was a significant announcement recently, and we're expecting the remaining 25 centres to be announced, maybe even before Christmas still. I just want to note too that since the report that you have in front of you was published as part of the agenda, council representatives led by the Mayor, who's not in attendance tonight, met with representatives from the Minister for Planning's office to discuss the ongoing reform program, convey community concerns, but also look to establish a collaborative working relationship with the government to ensure that we can achieve better housing and planning outcomes. So that's just for context since the report was closed. I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Williamson. Before we do that, we have one member in the gallery tonight that has asked to make a submission. So if I can call forward Julie Mulhauser to the table. Ms. Mulhauser, you know the procedure. I won't go through it in detail. But...
Thank you. Good evening. My name is Julie Mulhauser. I live in Canterbury. As you may recall, I made a deputation 3 weeks ago. 4 days later, after going on national TV, I finally received responses from the DTP to my questions on notice. Next slide. There were 2 bombshells in the responses: the complete absence of any targets for social and affordable housing, and the complete absence of any plans or funding for upgrading of services and infrastructure. Australia, despite being one of the world's wealthiest countries, has housing insecurity on a huge scale. This is due to 2 factors: the lack of social housing and housing being treated as a speculative commodity and wealth creation vehicle. Next slide. The state government claims that the rushed, poor process for the pilot activity centres is necessary so that we can act now to make sure we build a future where every Victorian can afford a home that's right for them. Without targets for social and affordable housing, social and affordable homes will not be built. Dr. Kate Shaw correctly points out that it was a scandal that a state-led pilot project would seek to build 60,000 new homes without stipulating one new affordable home. We are in an affordable housing crisis. The city is not short of high-end houses and apartments. It's the low-cost end we need to focus on. Next slide. The responses reveal that impact assessments have been done but not made public, and there are no plans or funding for upgrades to infrastructure and services. The infrastructure contribution mechanism, if it happens, will only be used for open spaces, pedestrian crossings, community centres and sports facilities. Next slide. The state government's failure to have plans and funding for upgrades to services and infrastructure in place before housing is approved looks set to guarantee a repeat of the disastrous Joseph Road precinct all over metropolitan Melbourne, including Boroondara. It's worth remembering that the government Sonia Kilkenny is part of has been in power for the last 10 years. Next slide. I've got 2 slides of requests for advocacy. There are 11 requests, so just very quickly go through them. Mandatory affordable and social housing targets, retention of the QVic road site, retention and maintenance of Homes Victoria properties, the Activity Centre program paused, a list of missing information made public. Next slide. Community forums, the integration of the CASB recommendations into Res Code, retention of third-party right of review, increase in standards in Res Code, retention of neighbourhood character, and a solution that supports and works with local councils on their detailed plans to increase density.
Thank you. Councillors, are there any questions of Ms Mulhauser? Councillor Hollingsworth.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for your presentation. May I ask, was that your last slide?
Yes.
Yeah. Well done for getting it all concluded within that short amount of time. Is there anything that you would like to add to your presentation that you didn't get the opportunity to mention just then?
Sorry, I've tried to fit the points. I suppose when you look at the really extensive amount of missing public information that's on the slide beforehand, just if we go back one, so that's information that really should be expected to be in the public domain. As I mentioned at the start of my presentation, I submitted questions on notice in the community reference group and was told I would be given answers before the 29th of September. And in order to get those answers, I'd been advocating through the offices of John Berger, who is the chair, and Monique Ryan, who had an observer, and still I got no answers, and then I went on national television. So I think it really speaks to the fact that the opacity of this process is very, very concerning, and the lack of genuine engagement with not only the community but with council and the rationale given for that haste, which is that affordable housing needs to be delivered, and yet we have the statement within the responses that says there are no targets for affordable or social housing, and experts giving the response that without that there won't be any built. Yep.
Thank you. And can I just ask, was that presentation, the answers to your questions, was that shared just to you, or was that shared to the group that you've been consulting with?
So I believe it was addressed to CRG members, and I think that was only the Camberwell Activity Centre CRG members. I'm not sure whether it was the members that attended the second meeting, which was roughly half of the number of members that attended the first. Yep.
All right, thank you for sharing. Yes.
Councillor Friend Priero.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Dr. Mulhauser. You've done extensive and detailed research, so my question...
Microphone, John. Microphone.
Sorry, you've done extensive research, Dr. Mulhauser, and I appreciate that. My question goes to page 2 of the frequently asked questions document from the department, which includes a bullet point that says delivering more affordable housing by utilising strategic sites, including government landholdings. From your research, what sites of this type have been included in the activity centres by the state government to date?
There's no provision, and if I think I distributed the responses to my questions on notice, and that's responses 15 and 16. I had specifically asked for the implementation details. Yep.
Thank you. And a follow-up question on that. If you were asked to identify government landholding sites in Burundara, are there a few that spring to mind that might be used for this purpose?
Well, the Kew Vic Road site is the obvious one, but there are other sites. I don't have any encyclopedic knowledge, but there's, the state government is now selling off VicTrack land in, I think, Oakley and Footscray, Broadmeadows, I'm not sure. But so there will also be VicTrack land that is in Burundara as well. Yep.
Thank you very much.
Councillor Baillieu.
Thank you, Julie. And through you, Chair, I just want to firstly reassure you that many of the points you've made tonight we have taken to the Minister's office, and we did raise affordable housing at the Kew Vic Road site. My question is in relation to your dialogue that you've had with many MPs and leaders across Victoria in relation to this issue. How much appetite do you think there is amongst those MPs, particularly within the Labor Party, to build affordable housing into this plan?
I haven't received any assurances that will be the case. Yep. I specifically asked that of John Berger when I met him recently. Said, the details that we have in front of us, what assurance can we be given? And he couldn't give me that assurance. Yep.
Thank you.
Councillor Nolan.
Thank you, Julie, and through you, Chair. Thank you for your presentation. Just if you could expand a little on the retention of Kew Vic Road site, do you mean the retention by the state government?
Yeah.
Do you mean retention of the building and with a view to retain? What does that mean exactly?
Retention in public ownership for public and affordable housing, ideally. Yep.
Thank you.
Councillor Osborne-Smith.
Thank you, Dr. Mulhauser, for your presentation. I always enjoy them, and I in particular enjoy how you managed to fit them in 2 minutes and 59 seconds. So well done, thank you. You've spoken with great passion tonight about social and affordable housing, with good reason. I'm keen to shift your focus for a moment to talk about heritage. Would you care to elaborate in a minute or so about your thoughts and your investigations about impact on heritage in our municipality?
I think the officer's report points to it again. The responses to my questions on notice, again, there is no clarity. I'm paraphrasing, but they use the word balance, and clearly there is a pull in opposite directions between conservation and increase in density, and there's still, despite many inquiries, there still is no clarity as to how that will be implemented. Yeah.
Thank you.
Councillor Bookie.
Thank you, Julie. Are there any ways in which you would like to see council be more active in addressing the shortage or the lack of foresight around social housing? How do you think we can play a part in helping to solve that?
Yeah. So at the earlier question that I asked at the council meeting outlines that the council in previous social housing and affordable housing has been an advocate, and I think that's a really important role to play. It seems clear that targets, a mandatory target, is in fact the way to go to ensure it. That age article that I referred to, and I was actually able to supply Adam Carey, the journalist, with my responses to questions on notice. The affordable housing providers are saying a 16.5% mandatory inclusionary target is necessary. Yeah.
Thank you very much. There doesn't appear to be any further questions. Thank you for your presentation tonight. Mindful that we're 11:15 and the bewitching hour will hit us fairly quickly, I've discussed with the officers and there's no intention to expand further on matters arising. But if any councillors have pressing issues they want to ask of officers, if you could now do it fairly promptly so we don't have to extend the meeting necessarily. Councillor Franco.
Thank you, Chair. Through you, are officers willing for future reports and presentations in relation to the new activity centres to show the complete impact or potential impact on the city of Boroondara? And I specifically refer to the foreshadowed or identified activity centre along Gardner and Glen Iris train stations, which runs along the boundary of my ward, but just over the boundary in Stonington. If an 800 metre catchment is applied or a walkable catchment is applied, it takes in a large segment of Gardner Ward, and we already have a large segment of Gardner Ward covered by the Camberwell Junction Activity Centre, but my concern is that some of our documents don't identify the Gardner and Glen Iris Activity Centre and the potential impact, and I'd like to see that as something we take into consideration.
Through yourself, Chair, noted, we've actually mapped an 800 metre impact within Boroondara municipality for those activity centres in the adjoining municipality, so we do have a good understanding of that impact. Having said that, our understanding is that there needs to be significant work undertaken by the Department of Transport and Planning before they arrive at what a suitable walkable catchment will be around each of these activity centres. We will liaise closely with Stonington Council in relation to those to ensure we understand those impacts on Boroondara.
Thank you. And look, I'm not asking for a definitive answer in relation to this, but if we've done that mapping, I'd certainly like to see a copy of it. And if it's deemed appropriate to update materials on our website and the like to include those neighbouring activity centres, it might be appropriate to do so. Again, I'm not expecting to put you on the spot now and commit something, but it's something I'd certainly like to have considered going forward. Thanks.
Councillor Osborne-Smith.
Thank you, Chair. Regarding the officer's recommendation on screen now, I'm wondering if you could comment, officers, on the words continue to work. Perhaps in the interest of those in the public listening and beyond, I'm keen for you, if possible, to expand on that as to some specific actions that you have identified in the coming weeks and months regarding that?
Thanks, Chair. Council officers have been meeting with officers from the Department of Transport and Planning, and those regular meetings have occurred throughout this year as the planning work for Camberwell as one of the pilot activity centres has been put together. Council officers have provided feedback, provided comments, provided suggestions to the officers from the Department of Transport and Planning throughout that time. We've got a good working relationship. Ultimately, some of the decisions and some of the planning reforms that have been put out throughout the year, however, have raised concerns that we have questioned, and we have again raised comments on in our formal submissions that we've put forward. We will continue to have a working relationship with officers of the Department of Transport and Planning, and we will continue to provide that feedback along the way. It's critical, it's important. As outlined in the initial presentation, we've also recently met with representatives of the Minister for Planning and again put forward a proposition of working collaboratively with the Minister and the DTP, and that will certainly be something that we'll continue to do. Burundara Council has worked also with the other councils that are affected by the pilot activity centres, by the 10 pilot activity centres, and we've put forward a proposition to the Department of Transport and Planning that reflects on how the consultation has worked throughout this year and where we think that can be addressed and improved. And we'll continue to work together and put forward a proposition so that the next 50 activity centres throughout Melbourne are planned in a considered way that addresses maybe some of the flaws of the planning that's occurred throughout this year for the 10 pilot activity centres. So we're putting forward a path that we're recommending as councils to the DTP about how that can be a collaborative approach moving forward.
Councillor, are you happy to hold any further questions? Because I'd like to seek a motion from the floor to extend this meeting to 11:15. Do I have someone prepared to move that motion?
Through you, Chair, I'm happy to move procedural motion 13 to extend the time of the meeting to 11:15.
Do we have a seconder to that motion?
Yeah, I'll be happy to.
Do we have an order of speakers?
Well, we haven't got two screens, so I'm going to have to go on lights. Councillor Rabuki, are you happy to second that?
Happy to second.
Thank you very much. All of those in support of that motion? Carried unanimously. My apologies for that interruption. Councillor Osborne-Smith, did you have further questions?
Thanks, Mr. Walker. The answers with respect were looking in the rear vision mirror predominantly, other than your comment about the broader activity centres and the comments and concerns you and other councils have. I'm just wondering if there's any specific plans you can share with us tonight for upcoming meetings, documents you might be preparing, and the like, that can give us and perhaps our residents some comfort that we are very much on the front foot in this exercise.
Again, through yourself, Chair, and I think that goes back to the strategic planning work that this council has done and is continuing to do. And the strategic planning work that we have done over the last couple of years includes our housing strategy, includes our Camberwell Junction Structure and Place Plan. It includes preliminary work on reviewing our character in our residential areas. So the future components of the work that we're doing includes an analysis of the housing targets that have been given as drafts in Plan for Victoria consultation, and we've looked at modelling that throughout the municipality and what that might mean in terms of how we can accommodate that. Now, that piece of work is being finalised at the moment, and that's going to enable us to be able to say where we think the growth can be accommodated in Burundara, and bring that back to you as a councillor group to look at and say, yes, we agree with that proposition, that there's a good, positive way forward of demonstrating where we can deliver additional housing. We're looking at activity centres, so our neighbourhood activity centres, for what they can look like and will look like in the future, because there's opportunities there around those activity centres. And we are also continuing to look at how additional controls to manage amenity essentially within our residential areas, such as tree controls, urban design outcomes, and future planning controls that guide development and housing. And they're also initiatives that we'll be bringing forward to you throughout next year.
Thank you.
Councillor Sinfield.
Don't have a question, but I'm ready to move a motion when the time is right, Chair.
Oh, thank you. Councillor Hollingsworth.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Walker. I just wanted to ask if you've considered reaching out to Jerome Weimer as well, who's been appointed this week as the Secretary of the Housing Statement Implementation, as another party to interact with Council's questions.
Through yourself, Chair, we will certainly be taking that opportunity up. In fact, we had that very discussion amongst a group of council planning directors today that we will be looking to reach out to.
It's wonderful. I know
Department
he's
Secretary.
very active and very much in the media at the moment. And sorry, my final question was with regard to if you're able to elaborate if there's any more indications of heritage precincts that are abutting the walkable catchments. Is there any commentary coming back that may recognise the significance of those areas and additional protection to them?
Through yourself, Chair, we have had that discussion in this chamber a number of times around perhaps some gaps or some concerns that we may have about how heritage will be considered in the context of a walkable catchment zone and the aspirations and directions and objectives of a walkable catchment zone. We haven't had clarity around that at this point. That's still something that remains to be seen, exactly how the controls will work with each other. We haven't seen the final walkable catchment zone controls, so we are yet to understand exactly how that will work, and that's something that we continue to ask questions around.
Thank you.
Councillor Friend Priera.
Thank you, Chair. Bear with me for 1 second. Going forward, we've identified, I guess, in the frequently asked questions document from the department, they make at least 12 references to affordable housing. And one of my technical questions is, and this might be something you want to take on notice, is how does Amendment VC 242 under the housing statement potentially impact the commitment to affordable housing? So I think this provision allows the Minister to call in developments that contribute significantly to affordable housing. And building on that and the previous presentations, it's the question of, outside of the activity centres, what state-owned land assets have we identified that would be appropriate for the provision of increased housing? And I'm talking specifically about Soloway Ward, which already provides twice the number of housing that any other ward does in terms of public and social affordability housing. Thank you.
Again, Chair, through yourself, this concept of affordable housing has been something that's been on the table and been part of housing discussions for a number of years now. And we've had a number of statements and policy objectives put forward within the planning system around aspirations for future affordable housing. What we haven't had is anything that obliges it or requires it. So there's nothing in the planning system that puts any requirement or expectation on affordable housing outcomes. There, and I could go through a whole range of changes and inclusions into the planning system, but they frankly are not worth the paper they're written on, because they actually have no force or effect if a developer doesn't agree. A developer has to agree. There have been some light carrots, if you like, put into the planning system that might encourage and enable some affordable housing outcomes, and that's that Amendment 242 that you make reference to. And what that did was provide an opportunity for a developer to refer developments of a certain scale, and they've got to meet certain tests, but if they meet those tests, then they provide up to 10% affordable housing, then they can apply to the development facilitation program to have that application considered by the state government system, not by council. So it was an offer to give a streamlined process for considering that sort of application. But that can be waived or varied. So it's, again, not a requirement or a stick. There's a little bit of a carrot there. Very, very few projects. In fact, I'm not aware of any significant projects that have availed themselves of that opportunity, because it simply doesn't give enough of a bonus or incentive for developers to use that sort of path.
Councillor Sinfield and Councillor Osborne-Smith, your lights are both on again. Are they? You both had a bite at the cherry tonight. Have you got pressing questions?
No question.
Got it.
No questions from me. I would just seek your permission, Chair, to speak to the motion when that opportunity is right, given that I am the Ward Councillor for Junction Ward, which is well affected by these reforms. Thank you.
So now is the time to move a motion. Councillor Sinfield.
Then if my colleague is indicating that he wishes to speak as Ward Councillor, I will withdraw the foreshadowed motion.
Thank you.
So that we only have one speaker, Chair.
Councillor Osborne-Smith, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Councillor Sinfield. I appreciate that. Well, I would like to move the motion to support the officer's recommendation and say a few words in support of that, if I may.
Please proceed.
Thank you. First, let me...
Sorry. No. I have been dutifully reminded that I didn't get a seconder. I was reading you two as a pair. Can I have a seconder to Mr Osborne-Smith's motion?
You can.
Thank you, Councillor Sinfield. Now, Councillor Osborne-Smith, please speak to your motion.
Thank you, Chair. First, let me commend the Burundara officer, Scott Walker, and his team in comprehending the vast and rapid-fire list of proposed planning law reforms issued by state government. It's been a huge amount of work, and I am grateful on behalf of all councillors for your timely, professional and well-reasoned responses that you have prepared. So thank you very much. As Ward Councillor for Junction Ward, which is one of the first activity centres earmarked as part of these government reforms, and the home of thousands of heritage protected properties, I would like just to add a few words for the record tonight, particularly with respect to the walkable catchment zones and heritage protection. I'd like to just remind those listening and for the record that council officers have acted prudently and quickly over the last several months in responding to multiple state government submissions, and have represented as best as possible council's position with respect to those. So one example is, of course, the submission on the Camberwell Junction Draft Activity Centre, in which council opposed the identification of a walkable catchment of 800 metres, I remind everyone that the catchment area in Junction comprises around 10,800 properties. 4,500 of those are subject to heritage protection, which is 48% of the catchment area. So this puts Camberwell Junction in a unique area, a unique position as compared to many of the other activity centres identified as part of the government's reform. We opposed the identification of those walkable catchment zones. We pointed out that no consultation had been undertaken with council or the community on this new catchment area, and our submission opposed this walkable catchment area given the lack of strategic justification, its failure to consider local context, including heritage, streetscape character, flooding or public transport access. And it went on to say the blanket application of housing density represents poor planning involving inadequate consideration of important local features and constraints and resulted in illogical outcomes. Further, the council has responded to the state government in relation to their plan for Victoria housing targets, citing a lack of evidence. It's also responded to the submission on ResCo's reforms in September, raising concerns regarding the deemed to comply approach and the effective removal of neighbourhood character as a consideration in planning permit assessments. And finally, our council has responded on the activity centre draft planning controls in October, and again raised concerns with the walkable catchment zone and provided comments on the proposed apartment design standards. So we've done a bunch, led by you and your team, Mr. Walker. This council has made numerous submissions to state government on numerous occasions, raising our concerns. And of course, most recently, our council has met with the state government and its representatives to again put forward our position with the Minister for Planning and their staff to personally convey our concerns, particularly about the impact of Boroondara's unique and valued heritage precincts. Now, whilst the community have called for some more radical action, the consensus of this council is that that may be counterproductive and that we seek first to work with the state government to establish a productive dialogue, and we believe that is the best way to achieve better housing and planning outcomes for our municipality, which has such unique issues as our heritage properties. And I look forward to further announcements in the coming months, not only from government, but in particular our response to it. So in conclusion, I just wanted to say that...
very briefly.
Yeah, very briefly, in 30 seconds or thereabouts, that I represent some 9,000 constituents in the Junction Ward area. I've talked to many hundreds in recent times, and in summary, they are mad, and they are asking what we can do. And I say that whilst we have a strong commitment to supporting housing growth, which will accommodate more Melburnians, I think it is most important that I say tonight that we have the most, or one of the most important roles for this council in the coming months, and that is to fight for and protect our incredible heritage legacy that we are privileged to have in our city. And our homes, our shops, our public buildings and our parks and trees, which we love and cherish, and which we use daily, must be saved and protected from these dramatic state government housing reforms on our doorstep.
Thank you.
We are, in final comments there, I would like to remind everyone that we are custodians of our heritage for future generations, and we should not sit idly by. I give you commitment, Council, to support this officer's recommendation. Thank you very much.
That was a Christmas speech allowance. Now, very quickly to try and wrap this up in time, I'll have to ask, is there any opposition to the motion as moved and very diligently spoken to? There is none, therefore I will not extend to any further speeches. So I'm going to put the motion. Those in favour? It is carried unanimously. Thank you very much. I'm also, in wrapping up the meeting, I'm also reliably advised that there is no general business, there is no urgent business, and there is no confidential business tonight. So unless there's any howls or cries, I will move to close this meeting. Before I close the meeting, I want to thank all of you who have joined us this evening, and I declare the Urban Planning Delegated Committee closed. Thank you.